At 91, I've lived long enough to know that most of what we worry about is just noise. Here's what actually mattered. When you have lived for 91 years, you develop a very clear sense of what was worth worrying about and what was not. And the ratio is not what most people expect it to be. My name is Estelle. I'm 91 years old. And what I want to tell you from this particular distance is that the list of things that actually mattered is considerably shorter than the list of things I spent my life treating as if they mattered, and that the difference between those two lists is, in my considered view, most of what I would go back and change if I could go back and change anything. I want to tell you the whole of it, because at 91, I have no patience left for the partial version of things. And because the partial version is what people usually tell you when they want to, sound-wise without actually saying anything that costs them something. What I'm going to tell you today is going to cost me something, which is the only way I know to tell it. I was born in 1933 in a city in northern Ohio, the third of 4 children, in a family that was working class in the years when being working class meant something specific about the texture of daily life, about the consciousness of money that you carry when there is never quite enough of it, and when the margin between stability and its absence is thin enough to feel all the time, like a draft through a window that is never quite fully closed. My father worked in a factory that made automobile parts, and my mother worked the same hours at home that he worked at the plant. And between them, they kept 4 children alive and clothed and educated with the specific efficiency of people who cannot afford to waste anything, including time. I was a worrier from the beginning. I want to say that because I think it is important to the story I am telling, and because some of what I am going to tell you is not the discovery of a naturally serene person who happened to acquire perspective at a late age, but the hard-won education of a woman who spent 9 decades in a more or less continuous argument with her own anxiety, and who has finally, at 91, arrived at something that functions like peace. The peace did not come from the anxiety stopping. The anxiety has been a feature of my interior life since I was old enough to have an interior life worth describing. The peace came from learning, slowly and through a great deal of evidence, what the anxiety was and was not accurate about, which is a different thing than making it go away. I worried, as a child, about the money, the way children who grow up close to financial instability worry about it, with a background consciousness of it that is not panic, but is also not entirely comfortable. A low and continuous awareness that things are fine right now, and that fine is not guaranteed. I worried about whether I was smart enough, pretty enough, likable enough, good enough at the things that seemed to require goodness. And these worries were not unusual for a girl growing up in the 1940s in an environment that had opinions about what girls were supposed to be, and that expressed those opinions with the consistency and confidence of a culture that has not yet been sufficiently challenged about them. I went to college on a scholarship, which felt at the time like the most significant thing that had ever happened to me, and which, from the distance of 91 years, I understand as one of the significant things, but not the most, which is the kind of reordering that comes with perspective, and that I wish I had been able to do earlier. I studied education because it seemed practical, and because I genuinely liked children and understood, intuitively, that teaching was work that mattered, and because my own teachers had been some of the most important people in my young life, which seemed like sufficient evidence that teaching was worth doing. I graduated in 1955 and began teaching 4th grade at an elementary school in Columbus, Ohio, and I taught, with intermissions for the raising of children and the management of the various demands of a long life, for 31 years in total, which is a number that still surprises me when I say it out loud, the way the large numbers of a long life always surprise you, as if the accumulation happened while you were paying attention to something else. I married a man named Arthur in 1957. Arthur was from Pennsylvania, the son of a coal miner, and he was the kind of man who was easy to underestimate on first impression and who revealed himself, across years of closer acquaintance, to be one of the more genuinely intelligent and deeply decent people I have ever known. He was quiet in the way that some men are quiet, not from lack of interior life, but from a preference for keeping the interior life his own, until he had something worth saying. And what he said, when he said it, was almost always worth hearing. We were married for 56 years, until his death in 2013. And I want to say something about those 56 years that I think is both honest and relevant to everything I am going to tell you. We were not always happy. I want to say that clearly because the retrospective idealization of a long marriage is one of the things that happens when someone dies, and that is neither accurate nor useful to anyone who is listening. We had periods of real difficulty, periods of distance and misunderstanding, and the particular frustration that accumulates between two people who love each other and who are also, being human, intermittently terrible at showing it. We had a period in our late 30s that lasted almost 2 years, during which something had gone wrong between us in a way that neither of us had the vocabulary or the courage to address directly, and that we moved through eventually by the combination of stubbornness and residual affection and the practical necessity of two people who have built a life together and who, on balance, want to continue building it. I worried about our marriage during that period with an intensity that was exhausting and that produced, in the way that anxious attention often produces the opposite of what it intends, a kind of hypervigilance that made things worse rather than better. I worried about whether we would survive it, whether what was wrong was too wrong to be fixed, whether I had made a mistake that was now going to define my life in ways I had not chosen. All of that worry, which occupied a significant portion of my interior life for nearly 2 years, produced nothing useful. What actually resolved the period was not the worry, but a conversation Arthur and I had one evening in our kitchen in 1976, a conversation neither of us had intended to have, that opened something that had been closed and let some air into a space that had been without it for too long. The conversation was the thing. The worry was noise. I am going to keep coming back to that distinction between the thing and the noise, because it is the central thing I have learned in 91 years, and the thing I most want to communicate to you. And it is harder to communicate than it sounds, because the noise feels, when you are inside it, exactly like the thing. The worry feels like engagement with the actual problem. The anxiety feels like preparation for the actual danger. The mental rehearsal of all the ways something could go wrong feels like reasonable precaution, rather than like the waste of the present moment that it actually is. And understanding the difference requires either a very long life or a very clear teacher. And I had the long life, so I'm trying to be the clear teacher. Arthur and I had 3 children. Our oldest, a son named Richard, was born in 1958. Then our daughter Louise in 1961. And our youngest, a son named Peter, in 1965. I worried about all of them from before they were born, and I have not stopped worrying about them since, which means I have been worrying about my children for somewhere in the neighborhood of 65 years. And I want to tell you what all that worrying produced, which is that it produced nothing. Not nothing in the sense that the love behind it was nothing, because the love was real and enormous, and is still real and enormous. But the worry itself, the specific activity of imagining the ways they might be harmed, or might fail, or might suffer, they produced nothing useful, nothing protective, nothing that made any of the things I worried about either more or less likely to occur. Richard had difficulties in his 20s that I worried about with the full investment of a mother who has convinced herself that sufficient worrying is a form of protection, as if by covering the territory of possible disaster thoroughly enough in my imagination, I could somehow prevent the disaster from occurring in reality. He struggled with his work, with finding a direction that felt right to him, with the particular uncertainty of a young man who has not yet understood what he is for, and I worried about him across those years with an intensity that I believed was love. And that was love, but that was also, underneath the love, a form of control, an attempt to manage through anxiety what I could not manage through any other means. He found his way. He always was going to find his way, which is what I understand now at 91 and could not see then at 35, because 35 does not have the evidence that 91 has. The evidence of 91 years is that people, the large majority of people, find their way, and that the finding is a process that belongs to them and that is not significantly aided by the worried attention of the people who love them. Richard found his way and built a life, and is 65 years old now and doing, by every measure I can observe, genuinely well. All those years of worry had no part in that outcome. His own work and his own decisions and his own character had every part in it. Louise went through a period in her 30s that frightened me more than anything had frightened me since the difficult period in my marriage. A depression that was serious and that required treatment and that lasted the better part of 2 years, and during which I worried about her with the sleepless, consuming intensity that parents of adult children in genuine difficulty will understand without my having to describe it in detail. I want to say something about that period carefully, because it is the case that my worry was in some sense appropriate, that what was happening with Louise was serious, and that concern was the correct response from the people who loved her. And I want to distinguish between that appropriate concern and the quality of the worry I was actually engaged in, which went considerably beyond appropriate concern into something that was more about my inability to tolerate her suffering than about anything that was actually useful to her. What Louise needed during that period was not my worry. She needed professional help, which she got. She needed the love of her husband and her close friends. She needed, from me, a presence that was calm and available and not communicating, through the quality of my anxiety, that her suffering was also a catastrophe for me, and therefore something she needed to manage on my behalf in addition to managing it on her own. What she got from me was love and presence, and also, I am honest enough to admit, the weight of my fear, which she felt and which she has told me. Years later, and in the kind of conversation that becomes possible between a mother and daughter once enough time has passed, added something to what she was already carrying that she would have been better without. I could not have worried less in that period. I want to be honest about that too, because I think the instruction to worry less, which is advice people give freely and which costs nothing to give, is not actually useful to people who are constitutionally inclined to worry, which I have always been. What I could have done, and what I wish I had understood how to do, was worry without making the worrying visible in the space between us, which is a skill that requires both self-awareness and the ability to find somewhere else to put the anxiety rather than resting it on the person who is already struggling. I did not have that skill at 55. I am not sure I have it completely even now, but I know now that it is the skill that was needed, which is at least a beginning. Peter, my youngest, has been the child I have worried about least across his life, which is a function of his temperament rather than of mine, because he is a man who moves through the world with a quality of ease that communicates, reliably and without effort, that he is going to be fine. He has had difficulties, real ones, the kinds of difficulties that everyone has across a long life, but he has met them with the equanimity of a person who has a naturally accurate relationship with what is, and is not worth significant distress. And watching him do this across the decades of his adult life has been one of the more instructive experiences of my old age. He got that quality from Arthur, not from me, and I have been grateful for it in him and reflective about its absence in myself in roughly equal measure. I want to talk now about the things that I spent significant portions of my life worrying about that turned out to be noise, because I think the specificity matters, and because the general statement that most worrying is wasted is easy to agree with and easy to immediately set aside, whereas the specific inventory is harder to dismiss. I worried for years about money in a way that the facts did not warrant, carrying into my adult and professional life the financial anxiety of my childhood, long past the point at which Arthur's income, and then my own income, and then our combined income, had established a stability that was real and durable, and that my anxiety was not protecting, but simply refusing to acknowledge. We were not wealthy by any standard that wealth implies luxury, but we were secure, genuinely and consistently secure, for most of our adult lives. And I spent a significant portion of that secure time worrying about security in a way that used up present comfort in the service of a fear that the present facts did not justify. I worried about what people thought of me with a frequency and a thoroughness that I now understand as one of the primary wastes of my interior life across several decades. Not in every situation. I was not a person who was generally lacking in confidence, but in certain specific contexts and with certain specific relationships, the question of how I was perceived occupied more of my attention than it deserved, which is to say, it occupied any of my attention at all, because what I understand at 91 that I did not understand at 40 is that the way you are perceived by other people is almost entirely outside your control, and that the energy spent managing it is energy stolen from the actual living of your actual life, and the theft compounds across years. I worried about my health, which is perhaps the most universally relatable category of worry I can offer you, with the specific quality that health worry has of being impossible to entirely dismiss as irrational. Because health is real and bodies do fail, and the concern is not without foundation. But what I can tell you from 91 years of worrying about my health is that the worrying did not prevent a single illness, did not slow a single deterioration, did not add a single day to my life or to the quality of it, and that the considerable time I spent in the waiting rooms of my own imagination, rehearsing diagnoses and their consequences, was time that was happening in the present and being spent in a future that mostly did not arrive in the form I had rehearsed it in anyway. I do not want to give you the impression that nothing I worried about was real, or that anxiety is simply a malfunction with no useful function, because that would not be accurate. Some of what I worried about was real. The difficult period in my marriage was real. Louise's depression was real. The financial constraint of the early years of our life together was real, if not as persistent as my worry insisted it was. I am not telling you that concern is inappropriate or that attention to difficulty is wasted. I am telling you that the ratio of real to noise, in my experience across 91 years, is approximately 1 to 10, which means that for every real thing my anxiety engaged with usefully, there were roughly 10 things it engaged with that did not require or benefit from the engagement. The things that actually mattered, and I want to be specific about these too, were fewer and simpler and more consistently available than I gave them credit for when I was in the middle of them. Arthur mattered. Not the version of Arthur that I was sometimes anxious about, not the Arthur of the difficult period, or the Arthur of the small recurring frustrations of a shared life, but Arthur himself, the person, the specific and irreplaceable particular human being who got up beside me every morning for 56 years and made coffee badly and read the newspaper with complete absorption and laughed at things that weren't that funny and was, in the ways that I understand now to be the ways that most matter, entirely present in his own life and in mine. He mattered in the daily texture of him, in the unremarkable Tuesday evenings that I was too often only half present in, because the other half of me was somewhere else in my head, rehearsing whatever the current worry was. The unremarkable Tuesday evenings were the marriage. That is what I know at 91. The unremarkable Tuesday evenings were the whole thing, and I was half there for too many of them. My children mattered in the way that the actual people they were mattered, not the versions of them I was managing in my anxiety, not the worst-case scenarios I was running in the background while they were in front of me being actually themselves. Richard at 7, showing me something he had found in the yard with the complete absorption of a child who has not yet learned to be self-conscious about enthusiasm. Louise at 12, coming into the kitchen after school and talking for 20 minutes about something that had happened with a friend, talking with the speed and the detail of a person who needs to tell someone who is genuinely listening. Peter at 4, laughing at something that was barely funny with the full-body commitment of a small child for whom laughter is not yet a managed response, but simply the thing the body does when something is good. Those moments were the actual content of my life. not the worry that was running alongside them, not the plans I was making, or the problems I was solving, or the future I was preparing for. The moments themselves, the actual present tense experience of being in a life with the people I loved, that was what was real, and I was present to it with about 60 or 70% of myself for most of the years it was happening, because the other 30 or 40% was elsewhere, doing the thing I thought was responsible and was actually just noise. I taught school for 31 years, and the children I taught mattered in a way I could not have told you when I was in the middle of teaching them, and that I understand now with a clarity that sometimes stops me. I have had, across the decades since I retired, more encounters with former students than I can accurately count. People in their 40s and 50s and 60s who have told me things about what happened in my classroom that I did not know were happening. Things I said or did, or simply was, that shaped something in them that they carried forward. I did not know I was doing most of it. I was just teaching, just trying to do the work with the attention and care it deserved. And the doing of it with attention and care was, it turns out, more than sufficient. That is another thing I would tell my younger self, and tell you. The work that you do with genuine attention is doing more than you can see it doing. You will not know, for years or decades, what it accomplished, and the not knowing is not evidence that it accomplished nothing. The evidence, when it arrives, is usually in the form of a person who has carried something forward from a moment that you had almost forgotten. And the carrying forward is the proof that the moment was real and that it mattered. I am 91 years old, and I live in a small apartment that is a reduction from the house where I raised my children, and that I have made into a place that is genuinely mine, that contains the things that have mattered enough to keep across all the moves and reductions of a long life, and that together form a kind of autobiography of what I actually valued, as distinct from what I worried about. There are photographs of Arthur and of the children and the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren. There are books that I have read and reread, and that still, at 91, open something in me when I return to them. There is a plant on the windowsill that Louise gave me 5 years ago, and that I have kept alive with a satisfaction that is slightly disproportionate to the achievement, as if the keeping of it is evidence of something I need evidence of. There are no records of the worry. There are no artifacts of the anxiety, no trace of the 10,000 hours I spent in the rehearsal of difficulties that mostly did not arrive, and that, when they did arrive, were navigated not by the rehearsal, but by the resources of the moment, the same resources that would have been available without the rehearsal, and that were somewhat depleted by the time they were needed, because the rehearsal had used them up. My granddaughter, Louise's youngest, is 28 years old, and she came to visit me last month and sat in the chair across from mine and told me about everything she was worried about, which was considerable, because she is 28, and 28 has a great deal to worry about if you approach it that way. And she does approach it that way, having inherited from her mother and from me the particular disposition toward anxiety that runs, I see now, as a thread through the women of our family. She listed the worries with the thoroughness of someone who has been cataloging them carefully. The job, the relationship, the apartment, the future, the sense that she is behind some schedule that everyone else seems to be on, the fear that the choices she is making now will constrain what is available to her later. I listened to all of it. I did not tell her not to worry, because that is not useful advice, and because the worry is real to her and deserves to be heard before it can be assessed. And when she finished, I said to her, "Most of what you are worried about is noise. Not all of it, because some of it deserves attention, and she is smart enough to figure out which is which. But most of it, the ratio I have arrived at across 91 years, is noise." She looked at me with the expression of someone who has heard this before and is not sure it applies to her specific situation, which is the correct response, because everyone believes their specific worries are more justified than the general category of worry, and sometimes they are, and often they aren't. So I told her what I am telling you, not the general principle, but the specific evidence, the inventory of what I worried about, and what it produced, and what the things that actually mattered turned out to be, and what they had in common, which is that they were all present tense and relational and available to her right now, in this year of her life, not in the managed future she was trying to construct through the anxiety. The relationship she was worried about losing was sitting across from her every evening, requiring not her worry, but her presence. The work she was anxious about was work she was already doing, and the doing of it with genuine attention was what was needed, not the rehearsal of its possible failure. The sense of being behind a schedule was a comparison to a fiction, because the schedule she was measuring herself against was not real, was a composite of other people's external circumstances that told her nothing about whether her own life was proceeding correctly. And the measuring was stealing the present moment she was actually in, which was the only moment available, and the only one that would ever be real. I told her that the most important things in my life were not the things I had managed successfully. They were the people I had been genuinely present with, and the work I had done with genuine attention, and the moments I had allowed myself to actually inhabit, rather than passing through, on my way to the next worry. That is a short list. It is a list that was available to me at 28, at 38, at every age I have lived through, and I was more fully available to it, at some ages than others, and the ages when I was most available to it were the happiest periods of my life in the only sense of happiness that I now understand to be real, which is the sense of genuine engagement with what is actually here. I am 91 years old, and I am going to tell you the most honest thing I know, which is that the length of my life has given me only one significant advantage over someone who is 28 or 45 or 63, and that advantage is evidence. I have evidence, 91 years of it, about what the worry produced and what the presence produced, and the evidence is not ambiguous. The presence produced the things I am most grateful for. The worry produced fatigue and the loss of moments I was in without being in, and nothing else that I can identify with any specificity. You are in a present moment right now. Whatever you are worried about is not in this moment. It is in a future that does not yet exist, and may not exist in the form you are rehearsing. The people you love are available to you in this moment in a way they will not always be available, because people are not always available forever, and you do not know when the availability will change. The work you are doing is capable of mattering in ways you cannot yet see, if you give it the genuine attention that makes things matter. These are not complicated observations. I am aware of that. They are the kind of thing that is easy to agree with, and then to set aside in favor of whatever the current worry is demanding, because the worry is loud, and the present moment is quiet, and the quiet things are always at risk of being drowned out by the loud ones. I have been listening to the loud things for most of 91 years. What I want to tell you from this particular distance is that the quiet things were the ones that mattered. The loud things were almost always noise. And the capacity to tell the difference, which I am still developing at 91, which I suspect I will be developing until there is no more time left to develop anything, is the closest thing I have found to what people mean when they use the word wisdom, which I have been reluctant to claim for myself, but which I am willing today to gesture toward. The quiet things, the present moment, the people in front of you, the work in your hands, the unremarkable Tuesday evening, that is, if you are paying the right kind of attention, not unremarkable at all. That is what actually mattered. That is all I have to tell you, and it is everything.